The only people for me are the mad ones.
The world is filled with the boring and the barely conscious.
And misery loves company.
But we don't have to live this way.
Jessica and I are here to talk to those the system rejects, to radicals and thought criminals.
The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but push the boundaries of acceptable discourse.
Those who stare reality in the face and dare it to be different.
History isn't made by the timid, and fun is not had by the perpetually afraid.
We are the mad ones.
So let's get to it.
Welcome to the Mad Ones. I'm your not at all a scientist host, Cam Harless, and with me, as always, is your more of a scientist than Cam hostess, Miss Jessica Green.
No.
I think you are. You took science classes in college well beyond what I did.
So that probably makes me less of a scientist than you, to be honest.
Maybe, but
Maybe,
you're married to a scientist, so I think you have more science in your life than I do.
It's like being a doctor's wife. You're like half a doctor?
Maybe.
Maybe.
So before we get going today, I do want to I want to remind you that we do have some sponsors. One being some great coffee. Run Your Mouth Coffee, rymcoffee.com. Also, check this out. I have started making mugs, and I will be showing you where to get mugs from our show very soon to drink this coffee.
Been asking for mugs forever. I'm so excited.
But if you go to rymcoffee.com, you can try out their bourbon barrel aged coffee, which is so good. Smells like heaven, tastes even better. rymcoffee.com, 10% off if you use the code The Mad Ones. Also, if you like dried meats, righteousfelon.com, they have some great beef jerky. You need to check it out. They have so many different flavors, and they're so good. That's righteousfelon.com. Promo code for that is Mad Ones, no the. But before we get going, one, I wanted to say thank you. We have two new patrons this week, Jonathan and Raymond, who are now helping us out. And also, Ryan jumped on in not an official patron way, but still to help us keep things going. And he paid for some very important things that we need to keep going. So I want to say thank you. If you want to join them and get our RSS feed with all of the past episodes, patreon.com/themadOnes. But we need to move on to the show, because you didn't come here just for me to mention, meat and where to find us. But I'm excited about this episode because I found this man on TikTok. I'm on TikTok because I'm hip, but I came across one of his TikToks that really stuck out to me, and I think I found him on his university's website and sent him an email. Like I didn't even, usually I'm like trying to find people on Twitter, and I was like, gotta find the official place to go. But joining us tonight is a PhD and a professor of nuclear engineering at North Carolina State University. He's a TikTok extraordinaire. He's a man of God in the world of science and a very apparently kind man, Dr. Robert Hayes. How are you doing?
Okey doke, how are you?
Doing all right. So I figure probably where we start the episode is with nuclear power and that, because I think the science is going to lead, just because as soon as I tweeted out that you were going to be on the show, there were arguments in the comments about nuclear power.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was wild, because I haven't, like I said, I'm not a scientist, but every time I've read into nuclear power and what people talk about and all the safeguards they use and the mitigation strategies and stuff like that, every time, and when I hear your TikTok, I'm like, this sounds like the safest option. This sounds like the best way to move forward, at least in the way of like mass electrical grids and things like that. I mean, I would love to have a little nuclear reactor in my backyard instead of having to get solar panels, but still, people are scared of radiation. I don't know if it's because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if it's because of Chernobyl or Fukushima, or I hope I'm saying that right, or any of the other, or Hollywood. But I feel like that's something that needs to be talked about more, because almost every person that I've known personally, when someone's mentioned nuclear, they've automatically went into fear mode. Is that something that you've witnessed a lot, being a doctor of nuclear engineering?
I do from the general public, but not from the academic circles of the STEM fields. As almost a blanket statement, those that are in the STEM fields recognize the requisite need of nuclear energy for our electrical needs. The International Panel on Climate Change even called it out, said we're not going to do it without nuclear. Yeah.
What do you think causes sort of people to have that automatic fear reaction toward nuclear? That, I mean, really, that's on like the public level. And do you think there's anything we could do about that?
So my expectation from my experience is that it's this great unknown. So nuclear engineering is probably one of the most difficult disciplines because we still have to deal with mechanical engineering and civil engineering, but then we also have to, so it's not just juggling those valence electrons in when we control nature, it's also the nucleons. And so that adds a whole new aspect to the design. And that has such a large amount of unknown with it that when you can couple that with danger, our natural response is to, if we don't understand something, is to often to fear it if there's any possibility of danger. And our default then is to assume the worst. So if I don't understand something and there's some danger there, my knee-jerk reaction is to assume that it's as bad as it can be. That way I can mitigate that. So if it's as bad as it can be, I'm going to take a reaction that's going to protect me if that occurs. If the worst that could possibly happen occurs, I'm going to protect myself because I don't know how bad it can be. So I'm going to prepare for the worst. And so that's I believe a normal and natural response to the unknown. And nuclear, for most people, falls square in the heart of the unknown.
Oh yeah.
Well, when people bring up like Chernobyl or Fukushima explicitly, what is typically your response to that? Because I've heard the stories of Fukushima, and I read the news and hear stories through the lens of I don't trust the press up front, to put it kindly. And so when I hear a lot of these stories and I hear things that are, really pushed, I go, how true is this? So obviously Chernobyl was awful. But like take Fukushima. I was going through your TikTok and you made some really interesting points because everyone talks about how deadly it was and how it was deadly for 9 years and people had to move. And I was wondering, when it came to Fukushima, how much of what we've heard is true and how much of what we've heard is just fear or fear mongering?
So unless you've actually gone to the scientific literature, it's probably all fear mongering. That's generally all that I see in social circles. So to put it in context, after Fukushima, the United Nations put together an expert panel to assess the health consequences. And in the same vein, the World Health Organization put together an expert group of people to assess it. And then the review papers came out, research papers came out, and they all said the same thing. Nobody has challenged this in any of the scientific literature, and that all of that radioactivity was insufficient to produce a statistically significant increase in any radiogenic effects to the Japanese public. There just wasn't enough. It was the containment was designed to handle a meltdown.
Okay.
And so there was radioactivity that was released, but let me put that in context. The radioactivity that was released was dealt with in an extremely conservative way. It's the same thing here in the United States. In the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency will recommend evacuation anywhere between 1 and 5 rem per year to the public. So if you have radioactivity in the environment that's between 1 and 5 rem per year, they're going to suggest you move. Now, the average dose to the United States citizen is just under 1 rem per year. About half of that is natural background and the other half is medical. You can get about 1 rem if you had a CT scan to the hip or to the pelvis. If you had a positron emission tomography scan, that's about 2 rem. And if you're getting those doses per year from radioactivity, Up to 5 rem, and the EPA will say evacuate. So these are not deadly doses. These are doses that if you get a lot of them in sequence, then you start to approach where you'll get a statistically significant increase where you can measure it. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so because we're conservative doesn't mean that it's deadly and scary. In fact, the only people literally that died from the Fukushima event, if you go and look at the literature, it was those that panicked in the evacuation. So it was fear that killed people. It wasn't the radioactivity. It wasn't the radiation. The dose was too small. It was too close to background, right? Everything's radioactive, always has been, always will be. So we actually get about 600 millirem per year on average. Half of that is just natural radioactivity from the earth. That's the same radioactivity that gives rise to, mostly that's where geothermal energy comes from, is the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium and potassium in the earth. And that's that same material that we pull out of the earth and fission it to make it break down much faster and concentrate it so that we can get the heat, get the energy out of it, rather than letting it go slowly over billions of years. And so, yes, it was a big mess, right? We had 3 out of 4 nuclear reactor core meltdown. Huge, right? And there was a release because of those explosions in the spent fuel pool. But that's not where the core would, it's the core that was that would have been the big chunk. And that's would have been what would have happened at Chernobyl. But the core, all of them were contained because we had a containment. That's the way the Western reactors were designed back in the 70s.
Right.
The ones we still have. And so all of that radioactivity from the core stayed there. And so we did not have a Chernobyl. What we had was a Fukushima. And the relocation guidance is still in that same vein. Is if you're getting these doses that are large compared to background, 2, 3, 4 times larger than background, then they can make that guidance. Even though literally you can go to places on the earth where the background is even twice that. There's a place in Iran, Ramsar, Iran, where the background dose rate is around 10 rem per year. But the population is too small to really say if there's any kind of statistically significant changes in cancer rates, because you need a large number. What we're talking about around 10 rem is on the order of about 0.5% increase in the natural incidence, which is around 40%.
Right.
And so it's 0.5% change is just too small to see unless you got a huge population that's getting that same dose. Because it's just such a small change, and basically it's dominated by other factors like stress or health or genetics or comorbidities. Those really are the dominant factor when you get down to those levels of cancer incidence. And so if there is a radiological effect from Fukushima, it's too small to see. It's just so small, it's in the noise. And so, yeah, it was a big deal in terms of money, in terms of making people move. But the design of these Western reactors was to do exactly that. So that although people would evacuate like we have here in the United States, they wouldn't have any medical effects from the radiation unless it was from the fear. And it's the same thing that happened with 3 Mile Island. The dose was comparable to background. It was a fraction of background of your annual background, a small fraction of your annual background, but it terrified people. And that was really the only measurable medical effect was from fear. And the same with Fukushima. In fact, here's an interesting one. If you look at the literature, Chernobyl, it's killed on the order of around 1,000 people. There were about 35 people that died outright from acute radiation syndrome. But then you look at the follow-on leukemias and thyroid cancers. There were a lot of other people that you can say there was a statistically significant increase. And it's clear on the order of about 1,000 people were lost as a result of that. However, the suicide rate has now outpaced that. And that's from this radiophobia. The fear is so bad that if you have this low-level radiation, you just think you're doomed. It's like every health problem you have is from Chernobyl. And every time you have a problem, it just confirms this belief that you have no hope. Every time something bad happens, it's just proof that you're cursed. And so the suicide rate has gone up. Yeah.
When you see these series that have recently come out, like the multi-night series that they had for Chernobyl, the dramatization of it, you saw these images of people who basically, like within a couple of hours and a couple of days, their skin is like melting off of their bodies. You talk about, we're evacuating people at 5, the incidence of maybe 0.5% of rates of cancer being raised is at 10. what level are we talking about where you do actually are having like skin melting? Like,
yeah, you're talking about 10, like on the order of around 10,000 rem.
oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's like going up and trying to hug the core or something like that.
Right.
Or maybe
Yeah.
a fuel bundle.
And these were the people who were like digging in the like the burning fire that was going on around Chernobyl. These are guys who were like directly right up against the building,
That
who
would
were
do it.
experiencing things. Right, right. So when we're talking about 5, and then we're evacuating people at 5, so this is not even something that would affect people, and we're already going to move them out of the area just in case.
It's a conservative measure. The point is,
Yeah.
it's a similar kind of a criteria for free releasing or granting a license, say, to a hospital. The idea is that if you're going to be giving people, injecting them with radioactivity and then releasing them, that you want to do that in such a way that it's going to give dose to other people a maximum dose that's on some fraction of background. So that if you do this for multiple vectors, then you're shipping nuclear waste, right? That can't give any more than a fraction of background. If you're doing radiography, industrial radiography for looking at the structure of bridges, looking for cracks, if you're going to be doing that, any kind of dose that would come from that would only give the members of the public a fraction of background. So you got these. That's where a license comes from. It means that you're not going to be able to do anything that's going to have any measurable effect, even if it's compounded many times over.
Mm-hmm.
That means that you can do it without control. That's the criteria. And so the argument is that you possibly could have multiple things like this happening all together, and then they compounded together would give you a measurable effect. And that's the philosophy. So it's ultra conservative. And that was largely to assuage the fears of people that thought, well, there's danger here. So nuclear would say, well, we will mitigate this to extreme amounts. Mm-hmm. And even though we do mitigate it to extreme amounts, we could do that at the price that we have today. It's often associated, well, if you're going to these extreme measures, it must be extremely dangerous. And it's really just a matter of, well, we can design these things to be freakishly safe, but it's going to cost. It doesn't come free. To make these things that safe, there's a certain amount of research and technology and infrastructure money that you're going to have to invest to give it that, right? It's kind of like if I wanted to make a car that could roll down a cliff and you walk away, that's not going to be a cheap car.
Right.
Right. We can design one.
Can you just give a broad layman's overview of what happens when something like that does go wrong? What are the fail safes, these freakishly safe fail safes that occur when a problem like Fukushima does happen?
So what we do in the nuclear industry is something we call defense in depth. And what that means is that you look at all possible pathways of sequences of events that can give rise to a meltdown. Okay. And so any one of those that might have to happen in any kind of a tree fashion, each one of those is going to have a control to prevent it. And so you would need to have to walk all of these paths and all of these controls to fail in order to eventually make it to the meltdown. And so it's considered defense in depth. And if any of these have multiple paths, you're going to have multiple controls to prevent that. And then last but not least, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is not going to provide you a license unless you can prove even if all of those fail, and for some reason all of those fail and you still have a meltdown, you still cannot challenge that 10 rem at the fence. Mm-hmm. Or 25 rem at the fence, whatever it is for whichever license you have. And that's if you're sitting there right at the fence and you sit there and you get the whole brunt of it, then that's the maximum dose that you would get. And that's what the containment does. And so the idea is that you have multiple layers of safety that's present, both engineered controls based on shielding and structure and so forth. You have active controls based on instrumentation and so forth. And then you have administrative controls, training, procedures, postings, and those kinds of things to make sure that all of those different things that could occur that would contribute to having a meltdown are being prevented.
Right. So with Fukushima, the idea just that I've gotten from the press is that an earthquake was bad enough to kind of subvert these fail-safe systems. Mm-hmm. But the impression that I got from looking at your TikTok was that these systems actually worked the way that they were supposed to. As a result, that no one was actually injured, more so than the fear of the radiation effects seemed to have caused people harm, but the radiation itself didn't cause harm. So can you tell me where the reality on that falls?
Sure. So what happened was that it operated as it was designed to operate.
Mhm.
The problem is that the design did not incorporate a 14-meter wave, it incorporated a 12-meter wave. And then that was compounded because that was basically supposed to be the 1 in 10,000 year wave height. You get some prediction, and they ended up having one that was substantially higher. And then that was compounded by what's called a single point failure by having the diesel motors in the basement. So those were flooded and they didn't have the diesel motors. So in essence, nature just bystepped that entire defense in depth by having this 14-meter wave when the design was to have a 12-meter height wall, which is what they had, and then that was then challenged and breached. And as a result, that final design feature, the containment, is what kept all of the radioactivity from the core contained. And so, yes, that exactly is what happened. They went through that entire process, all that defense in depth went out the window because nature threw this left hook. And so, but because that containment was there, the radioactivity from the core stayed in there, and all that you got was what was over there in the fuel pool. So as a result, the radioactivity that was released was at the levels that were comparable to background.
Okay.
Not substantially.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned that a lot of the deaths surrounding Fukushima had to do with fear. And I'm just curious because a lot of times with these situations, a lot of the death toll has to do with the management of an evacuation or the way that they talk about it. Would you say that in this situation, the people who died or lost their houses, that these were situations that stemmed from poor response, or is it just purely fear, in your opinion?
It was kind of both. So let's say that you had a large dose. Let's say it was 100 rem, and so that with that 100 rem, if you got that 100 rem, then you have a 5% probability of a 5% increase in your probability of cancer, right? So that's a massive dose. That's an atomic bomb level dose. But that would have been over a year, right? And so if you were to take something on the order of, say, a week to do it, then you're only getting a small fraction of that, right? And so now it's much more, and so now you're not going to get any measurable effects again because you took a week, right? Instead of trying to get out as soon as possible, if you just slowly get out, you're still going to be fine.
Right.
Because that's averaged over a year that we're talking about. And what they had at Fukushima was much less. And then on top of that, even if you had that 5% increase, it's going to take about 10 or 20 years before you're going to see any effects. That's from cancer. It still takes there's a latency period where nothing's going to happen until 10 or 20 years later, and then you'll start to see those solid tumors form, right? Okay. And so a large fraction of the people that died were people that couldn't evacuate themselves. They were in hospitals and nursing homes. And there was no reason to rush them out, especially if they didn't have a life expectancy that was more than 10 or 20 years. Does that make sense? It makes no sense at all. Yeah. And to compound the fact that the levels were sufficiently low that you could have had a leisurely withdrawal and still had that fraction of background contributed due to the fallout. There was no reason to panic. There was no reason for everybody to get the patients out and to take them out of a hospital and take them and try to provide for them when you're not in a hospital setting, right? A nurse probably can't handle more than 6 patients at a time, right? And that's in the hospital, right? And now you tell that nurse to get them out of the hospital and take them somewhere else and now take care of them. What is she going to do? What is he going to do?
Right.
But if you had thought it through and said, all right, well, where am I going to move them? All right, we're going to have to move them 3 hours away. All right, well, this is going to require a number of ambulances to start cycling. It's going to take a week. Okay, fine. That should have taken a week, but it didn't, right? It was it hurt a lot of people because everybody was afraid. They said, oh, it's time to leave. then that fear kicks in. I don't know how bad it is, so I'm going to pretend like it's as bad as it could possibly be. So I'm going to protect myself.
Right.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I mean, obviously people bring up the death toll. Obviously not Fukushima, but Chernobyl. And when that comes up, I don't know any of the numbers, but I have to wonder, because it seems like our government, for one, is not super into nuclear. They're far more interested in solar, wind, hydro, stuff like that.
It's coming.
But how, if have you looked at the death tolls, comparing those to the death toll even at Chernobyl? Like how do those compare or contrast?
Right. So this is going to surprise you. The worst of those in terms of death toll per gigawatt hour historically is going to be hydro. There was one in China, I think it was in 1975, where a hydroelectric dam burst and it took out villages anywhere between. So China claimed it was only tens of thousands, but the international community seems to think it's above 100,000 people died from that one hydroelectric dam. Right? Dam breaks, the water goes down, everybody downstream, and so that's happened in a number of cases where dams have breached. And so the deaths per gigawatt hour for hydro are huge. From coal and oil and natural gas, you also get large numbers, but you also have a lot of industrial accidents in there. Now, when you start to compare it with wind and solar, it's a little bit more difficult. I actually did do a recent analysis. I had it in a paper that I got submitted for publication, looking at a wind farm in Greece, where you look at the number of accidental deaths. And there you're basically just looking at people that fall off of the turbine. But what ends up happening is that they do have industrial accidents there in that industry, but they have such a small energy density. So even a small death rate, if you look at the number of deaths per gigawatt hour, if your gigawatt hour is small, that ratio becomes big. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Could you do me a favor, because I'm sure not everyone will know what gigawatt hour means.
I don't.
Could you briefly define that for us?
Do you know what a kilowatt hour is? No?
I don't.
Okay.
I'm more of a philosophy guy.
The meter on the outside of your house, it's going to measure in kilowatt hours how much power you used.
Gotcha.
Okay. And so that's what that little meter is going to read. Now, a gigawatt hour is like 1,000,000 times bigger, right? And that's the kind of power that a generating station will be able to put out. So you can supply millions of homes.
Right.
That makes sense?
Okay.
Yes.
I gotcha.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's a generating station, is going to be something on the order of a gigawatt. You can do a fraction of a gigawatt or multiple gigawatts, but that's kind of the convenient unit for electrical generation.
Okay.
These gigawatt hours. And so if you look at the number of accidental deaths per gigawatt hour from the different power sources, nuclear is one of the lowest. It's comparable to all of the others. And for the year of 2018, if you only look at the US nuclear, what was interesting is if you look at the rate from that one wind farm in Greece versus the number of deaths per gigawatt hour, in 2018, there were 0 deaths in all of the nuclear industry, people that died on the job from accidents. And so the number that would have been required per gigawatt hour to match what you had from that wind farm would have been in the thousands. And, if we'd had thousands of accidental deaths at nuclear power plants, that would have been huge. But
Right.
if you have a similar ratio in wind, it's an industrial accident, so it's not a big deal because we understand wind. But with nuclear, it's got to be much better.
I'm told there are components to like batteries and things like that that are used for solar panels that have to be like rare earth elements that are mined, and a lot of people are in terrible conditions in these mines. Are those deaths and the people living in those conditions figured into the death per kilowatt hour ratio?
So you can try to estimate that. The problem is that, for example, the Uyghurs in China are doing this. And to be able to get accurate numbers from the People's Republic of China is
China.
Yeah.
So there have been people that have tried to estimate that.
Yeah.
And when you compare that with nuclear, you've got to ask yourself, there are two ways of looking at it with nuclear. Remember I said that there's this, once you're below some threshold, it's a detection limit. So if there are increases, they're too small to see. Everything else is bigger at that level, right? Your general health, comorbidities, that's going to dominate the probability of you getting cancer. But if you think that there still is some that are down there and you add those in, then it's still comparable in terms of deaths per gigawatt hour. It's still comparable to the more traditional renewables. So the death rate is just extremely small per gigawatt hour. So if you want a gigawatt hour and you're wondering, and you want a small number of deaths per gigawatt hour, nuclear definitely is the way to go in terms of giving you base load, because wind and solar don't give you base load, right? They only operate when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And we don't right now have dispatchable storage so that they can store during the day to give you power during night or when the wind isn't blowing.
Right, right. There are, of course, elements that we use in nuclear power. And man, I am throwing some guesses out here, but like uranium and things like that that we use for these processes. Are these materials abundant enough for us to use them for this purpose?
So geothermal energy is actually a form of nuclear energy. Almost all energy is a converted form of nuclear energy of some sort. And the reason why is because the earth under your feet right now has about 3 parts per million of uranium and about 10 parts per million thorium. And so there are places where it's concentrated and you can mine it efficiently. The latest tech that's coming out is far more exciting. Right now, just from natural erosion off of the mountains, the amount of uranium that's being dumped into the ocean is about sufficient for about 9 times the annual electrical needs of the United States. It's just being dumped into the ocean, right?
Wow.
But that's because these are large rivers and they're dumping large volumes of water out there. And so we do have technology that would allow these fronds, if you spray them with a resin, this resin will attract the uranium from the ocean to it, and you can extract it at levels that are comparable. The latest results that came out of the national laboratories showed it was about 3 times the cost of traditional mining and milling to use these passive ocean fronds that would just wave in the water and absorb the material. But another paper recently came out where they claimed that they had actually got this to become cost effective or cost competitive with modern mining and milling. That's just the one paper. Whether that can be scaled up to an industrial process or be repeated remains to be seen. But it goes without saying that if you do research, it'll get to that point. And even if you stick with traditional mining and milling, I believe if we continue to do research, we'll just make it that much more sustainable, have a smaller footprint, have less waste. And the biggest issue really is that we don't recycle.
Yeah.
So right now, about 95% of the uranium in the fuel is just thrown away. And in making the fuel, we have a much larger volume of depleted uranium that's just thrown away. And if we started to recycle, we could use all of that. And then on top of that, if we were to do that and start recycling properly, then we don't have to take the plutonium and put them in a geological repository. The plutonium has half-life that's tens of thousands of years. The fission products are dominated by cesium and strontium, which have a half-life of 30 years. And so the volume of a geological repository that's needed would just be so much smaller. It would just be such a small footprint that it just simply requires that we recycle. But we're too tepid to do that because our political instability historically has not been sufficient to allow investors to say, oh, they're not going to change the regulations on me and make this no longer cost competitive, right? Because that's what happened in the Carter administration. After Gerald Ford put a temporary ban, Jimmy Carter put a full ban. And even though Ronald Reagan lifted it, right, who's going to invest, right? Those facilities are like $10 billion, right? Why are you going to invest in something that the politicians might say, oh, we're going to put a tax on you that's 10 times what it was before, and now you're out of business, right? If you don't have political stability, you can't have investment. Nobody's going to invest there. It just doesn't.
So me, as kind of like the layman voter, when I hear about the waste products from nuclear energy, I think very much of like The Simpsons, with a big jar or a big barrel full of glowing material that they seal up and then they cart down and, you know, hide under the earth somewhere, which of course is very, very dangerous material and you don't want it anywhere near you. Can you maybe help me or disabuse me of this image if that's the case? And because this is, I think, when politicians are talking to people about this kind of thing, what they have in their heads.
So the spent fuel goes into transportation storage containers. And these are large, like reinforced concrete monoliths. And we know how to shield this stuff. We can shield it so that even though it's spent fuel bundles that are in there, we can shield it so that the outside radiation rate is comparable to naturally occurring radioactive material.
Okay.
We can shield it down even lower if we wanted to. The point is that once you've got a fence, that fence, it's got to be a fraction of natural background on the dose rate that's there. And then these things have rigorous testing. They've got to be dropped onto an impenetrable spike in their weakest point. And then they've got to be dropped on an edge on their weakest point. And then they've got to be in like 1500 degrees Fahrenheit fire for 30 minutes. And then they got to be submerged underwater for like another half hour. All that in a sequence, and it can't leak.
Mm.
And that's what every one of those has to be able to do in order for you to be able to put the spent fuel in it. And that's only so that we can then move it into a geological repository. So the green goo is kind of like Spider-Man and the Hulk. It makes for good entertainment.
I see.
It's effective at that.
Well, and like we kind of mentioned the Chernobyl miniseries, but I was curious because when I was going through your TikTok and other things, there seems to be a disconnect when it comes to industrial accidents and what happened at Chernobyl or what happened at Fukushima or whatever. And so one of the things that you mentioned that I looked up very briefly was what happened in Bhopal, India, the gas leak. How is it that, I mean, obviously that's viewed as a tragedy, but how is it that 1,000 people dying from effects from Chernobyl are somehow worse than that? Could you possibly give us a little background on Bhopal and?
Yeah, the hydrogen cyanide leak from Bhopal, India, killed about 16,000 people. That was an industrial accident. So it's kind of like the hydroelectric dams when they break; those are considered industrial. Or, for example, maybe a better analogy is the tsunami at Fukushima, right? That killed 30,000 people, right? And where's the outcry for the 30,000 people that died? Well, that's a natural disaster, and it's a statistic at that point. And the same with Bhopal, India, right? It's a horrible statistic of an industrial disaster that occurred, but it's something that we understand, right? They were processing this cyanide-based material that when it leaked, it killed a lot of people. Cyanide is poison. And as horrific as that is, it's something that you can understand fairly easy. Maybe like DDT or PCBs or something like that. They're easier to understand. But Fukushima or any radiological event, if you don't have an appreciation for the levels and their consequences, then that default is going to be, I'm going to assume the worst. That way, no matter what happens, I'm safe.
Okay. Because I remember you mentioning it, and I was like, this seems a lot worse. I mean, Chernobyl is obviously horrible to watch, and I don't remember what the elephant's foot is, but I've seen a picture of it, and they make it seem like the most horrifying thing. And so I understand there's also optics on this, between cyanide and your skin essentially, at least played out as it melting off. And so I get that, but it seems to me that these are very similar accidents. These are both industrial accidents, and it seems like the propagandists' best weapon is to draw a line between those and make Chernobyl look worse than what happened at the hydro dam in China, or the Bhopal, the gas leak there. It does seem like there's an unfair, and I think that what you notice is if you look at the history of America and how we've pushed different technologies, how we've pushed energy and all of these things, it seems like Russia and China are doing more in the way of nuclear than we are, which is so strange, because it seems like America would want to be, because I mean, this is something that can make money, right? This is something we could sell. I mean, the recycled uranium or fuel cells that we put in silos forever, isn't that something that could be used to make money in some way? Like, why is it that this is something? I mean, you said political instability, but beyond that, why do you think that political instability, especially with the Carter? I don't know if Clinton did anything, but it does seem like it's a ping pong match, partisan ping pong match. Why do you think that America isn't pushing for it?
So, in terms of the recycling, we actually did have a facility that was being built at Savannah River called the MOX facility, mixed oxide, that would have demonstrated an industrial scale capability to start recycling. Because after that happened, I mean, in order to build anything, you're going to need an investor, right? You need somebody to put up the capital. Somebody's going to have to come up with the money. You're going to have to take out a loan, and somebody's going to have to loan that money to you, right? And whose name is going to be on the line? What collateral is going to be on the line? Usually that comes from an investor. And to get somebody that's going to invest $10 billion, they're going to need to have confidence that they're going to get a return.
Yeah. Elon's got to make his money.
Right. And so because it was recognized that our politicians did this seesaw thing on a given technology and said, we are going to stop this technology by passing some bills, then the question comes up, how do you know that's not going to happen again?
Right.
That's a lot of money.
But why do you think that they're so against it?
So the reason why Carter did it was because he was convinced, and at the time, the United States was leading in pretty much everything, including nuclear technology. And he believed that if the United States quit leading in recycling spent nuclear fuel, then everybody else would stop. That they needed us to lead in order for them to do anything. And what ended up happening was everybody else said, sorry, the genie's out of the bottle. We already know how to do it. It's like you didn't keep it a secret, and we want to recycle. So, okay, bye. We're going to go recycle. You go do what you're going to do, and, we'll be us over here. And so the other developed nations all continued to do recycling. And as a result, that's why the politicians that saw the benefits of nuclear wanted to promote the MOX facility. That way we could bring civilian recycling back. But Congress ended up killing it. And whether we're ever going to do anything again in the future remains to be seen. There is some hope for the small modular reactors, the molten salt reactors, the liquid metal fast reactors. There's a number of different modern tech reactor concepts that are being pitched that there is hope for. Some of them do require on-site small radiochemical processes. If you're doing thorium, for example, you're going to have to do some kind of similar radiochemistry comparable to recycling. That's a chemistry process. And you would have to do that. And the technology is definitely there, but whether it's actually going to come to fruition remains to be seen.
One of our listeners asked if there are any environmental impacts to creating plutonium.
So absolutely. There's this famous quote from Ralph Nader that plutonium is the most toxic element on the planet, which the guy's not a nuclear engineer, so he doesn't really know. But turns out that radium is comparable, natural radium, because it's got a bunch of decay products that all have alpha and beta emitters. And so if you concentrate radium, you have a similar issue on your hands in terms of the radiotoxicity of the material. And all that means is that, yes, the Earth is radioactive, always has been, always will be. And if you take certain parts of it and concentrate it, you can make that dangerous if you were to do that. And the same applies with radium, and it's comparable to what would happen if you concentrated plutonium. Now, I have heard other people say the solution to pollution is dilution. The idea being, well, the radioactivity came from the Earth. If we return it to the Earth, it's fine. Especially if we dilute it, and then it's just a small fraction of background again. As I consider myself an environmentalist, that's the way I was raised. The problem with that is the potential for abuse. That if you allow people to do that, then it's kind of like, all right, where do you draw the line at that point, right?
Right.
And it just makes sense. If it's concentrated, it's easy to control. It's really easy to control if it's concentrated. If you dilute it, then it's a lot harder to control. And so you keep it concentrated, and then you put it deep in the ground where it simply has the likelihood of that coming out is outweighed by whatever it would cause it to come out. For example, the waste isolation pilot plant is a good example. It's about a mile thick of water evaporites. About the bottom half mile is calcium sulfate, and the top half a mile is sodium chloride. So you put it right there towards the bottom of the sodium chloride, right? And what would it take to get that out naturally? If something natural can dig that up, you're not worried about that. You're worried about what's digging it up. Right?
Fair enough.
That's just, and so the geologists tell us that is the most stable formation you can have. The National Academy of Sciences have known this for well over 50 years, that if you put something there geologically, it's as stable as you could ever imagine or hope for geological stability to be.
No, go ahead.
I love that breath of, I know you want to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that I wanted to focus on somewhat in this episode, because all of this is great information. I'm very happy we talked to you, because I just learned way more than I ever had on nuclear before in my life. And so one of the things I wanted to focus on was kind of the reason why your TikTok interested me in the first place, and where you came from, your history. Because as I looked through your TikTok earlier today, it actually aligned so much with things that we've talked about previously, and the way I feel about things and the way things I've experienced. I want to talk about that. So I'm curious. I mean, I already know the answer because I asked you before, but Jessica's husband works in science, and I'm curious, how did you get to nuclear engineering? Like, how did you go from, where'd you start and how did you get there? Is very interesting to me, because like I've said, I'm more of a philosophical, creative type. And so like, I hate math. And so anything in that area, I'm like, I don't want it. So how did you get there?
Well, I love math. I've actually told my students, in my opinion, when God spoke the universe into existence, the language was calculus and statistics, because
that's what my algebra teacher told me. And I was like, he must not want to talk to me, man.
Quantum mechanics to cosmology, it's everything. It explains all of physical nature as far as we know. You just need calculus and statistics, and it's like, boom, everything. So I've always loved it. And so I ended up doing an undergraduate in math and physics. By the time I graduated, I started a family, so I went looking for a job, and there's not too many decent jobs if you've only got a BS in physics or math or both. So I figured, well, I'll get a graduate degree. So then I went back and got a master's degree in physics, and not much had changed. And I realized the jobs weren't in physics or general sciences. You had to go into engineering, right? And so by now I'd had multiple children. It's like, I'm going to have to make a lot more money to support these kids that
I know that
we're making. And
Kids
so I
are
figured,
expensive.
yeah. And what it was if I'm going to go into engineering, it's got to be the coolest form of engineering that there is. I can't just go do, civil or mechanical. I've got to do something amazingly awesome. I was like, oh, look,
Right.
nuclear. So I was like, yeah, all right, let's do nuclear. And I've been all in since.
Awesome.
Excellent.
And so, like I mentioned, the TikTok that interested me was you were talking about nuclear science and nuclear engineering, and you were walking around your house. And as you can see in the video behind you, there's a wall back there that has some crosses on it.
Yeah.
And
like
one of those internet atheists that's very angry that, Jessica used to be, was like, hey, how could you be a man? How could you be a man of science and have crosses on your wall? And you explained that. And I thought it was a fantastic explanation. And so I was like, of course I want to talk about nuclear science with him, but I also want to talk about this, because it's fascinating to me that if you look at the history of the world, and if you look at science, science as a tool to understand the world around us, as a tool to test and figure out both history and the current nature of the world, it has always been pushed forward by the church. And then something happened at some point. I want to blame Darwin because of the way he kind of pushed certain things. I'm not making a stance on evolution or anything like that right now. I have my feelings, but I'm just saying he didn't seem to like God. But you live in a world of science and you get pushback from 14-year-old atheists on TikTok. And I would love you to kind of basically go through that. And I'd also like to talk about your conversion experience, because you talked about that later.
Mhm.
And it was so fascinating. And I'd love to pick that apart a little bit
Okay.
in the kindest way possible, because I love it. So if you could tell me kind of what your explanation was to that person, that'd be great. Because like I said, I saw several TikToks from you before and I was like, oh, nuclear science, that's cool. And then I saw that one and I was like, okay, I'm a fan.
He sent it to me and was like, we have to talk to this guy. I was like, yeah, let's do it.
So how is it, you as a scientist, how do you square the circle, as people think it is squaring a circle, of being a Christian within that world? And how does it affect you?
So to me, what I love about creation is the rationality behind it. Like when so I know a little bit of biology, the radiobiology. I know that part about it that describes our understanding of radiocarcinogenicity, what the modern theory is on how cancer can start from radiation doses. But what I'm much more familiar with is fundamental engineering of the nuclear technology, such as my personal research is in radiation safety, radiological emergency response, and nuclear waste management. That's pretty much where I focus. And lately, I've been doing a lot in nuclear forensics. And so when I look at nature, the fact that once we have mathematics, that it's all something that we can conceive, understand, and explain in a way that is perfectly descriptive of modern science, that we can control it, we can mitigate it, and we can predict it because we understand it that well. And that's pretty much all of creation. Remember, I said calculus and statistics go from quantum mechanics all the way to cosmology and everything in between. And what that speaks to me is that where all this came from, to me, is the creator, in my estimation, had to have this same cognizance or more to be able to put this into us and to put this into nature. Just speaks of the most grand designer that you can have. I mean, I can look at a painting and say, wow, that painter had skill. Or I can look at a building and say, wow, that builder had skill. When I look at creation, I can say the creator has some amazing skill. And to me, the creator, because this is a creation, the creator then transcends the creation itself, right? The painter is not the painting and the builder is not the building. That's just their work. And so they transcend the work. They're greater than the work. They're able to do additional or change that work at their leisure. They could improve it or modify it as they saw fit, if they saw fit to do so, right? You might think that a painter that made a masterpiece would not want to touch it. You might say, other people might say that they would, and that would be just their opinion. And so for me as a scientist, it makes me more, in my estimation, it makes me more intimate with what was created. To me, it makes me more intimate with my creator to see what was created.
Yeah, it's Romans. I was just gonna say Romans 1 talks about how nature screams God's glory.
Good
and
point.
I love that, and that's what you've said in science terms, because I like I've said just recently in this episode, I'm a very artful, philosophical person, and so it's like the way I view God and the way that you view God, married, is a much clearer and cleaner picture of God than either of us have on our own.
Okay.
And I find that because you're like the flip side of my coin. And I find that fascinating, and I love it.
There's a idea that had been expressed to me that a physicist understands the beauty of a rose much differently than an artist does. And I think that's kind of what Cam might be angling at there, that there are appreciations for nature that are understood through mathematics that, not everybody can access. And before we started recording, we were kind of talking about that there are philosophical aspects to physics. I think that a lot of people view nature as a closed system, explainable, discrete, neat. And when you get down into like some of the quantum physics, things become less neat. There are, you know, some probability factors that kind of surpass our understanding of 1 and 0. Things are not either 1 or 0 at the quantum level, as far as my understanding goes. Again, super layman here, but I just I think that it's very, very interesting that there are constants in nature that if they were bumped off one or the other direction, that stuff like matter couldn't even exist. And this, I was trying to get into that a little bit before we started recording, but I think that for me, as someone who does come from I was once an atheist. I am raised in a philosophical universe that appreciates science. And so for me, that was something that actually suggested God, that things had to be so finely tuned that if they were not tuned in such a way, we wouldn't even be here to philosophize about these questions.
This is true. Yeah, there are a large number of constants in the universe that do that. But if I might talk about the quantum mechanics first, I would say something that's quite lovely about quantum mechanics is something like, for example, the particle wave duality. It's you could say, if I'm looking at a photon and I'm measuring to see if it behaves like a particle, it will behave like a particle. If I'm measuring to see if it behaves like a wave, it will behave like a wave. The same with an electron or a proton or a hydrogen atom or a buckyball. If I do an experiment that will show its wave properties, I'll see it behaving like a wave. An experiment that should look for particle properties, I'll see a particle. And so it's kind of like what you're looking for is what you'll find. And that has philosophical implications in and of itself. But
Very much
take
so.
it to a more extreme when you're looking at the uncertainty. You even had mentioned before the many worlds hypothesis, meaning that all of these possibilities are there, but once you make a measurement, you fix it on something, right? And to me, when I look at that, quantum mechanics is kind of, I know that the brain actually works that way in terms of the neurotransmitters. When you're talking about electrons moving or even molecules moving, it's quantum mechanics is going to be a huge effect there. And to me, the analogy that I see that looks like it's a one-to-one as a Christian is this concept, and I've heard it even debated in Christian circles, the apparent contradiction between predestination and free will, right? Do you have free will, and is there predestination? Do we know what the end of the times is going to look like? How is humanity going to end? How is the world going to end? How are these things going to occur when you have free will? And you got this butterfly effect concept. But like in quantum mechanics, the analogy would be, yes, you have free will, but once you make a decision, it's made. You could have made a decision left, right, or anywhere in between, but once you made it, then it was made. And it wasn't known beforehand what it would be. However, like in quantum mechanics, this uncertainty is what gives rise to very deterministic properties of materials. The quantum mechanical properties give rise to what we had previously thought were deterministic, and they are deterministic on a macro scale. Even though these quantum mechanical uncertainties are taking place, when you average them over Avogadro's number of atoms, that has a very predictive behavior, and it becomes very deterministic. The argument with people being that once you have a large enough group of people, crowd statistics take place, and it becomes very predictable. Even though when you're leaving a stadium, you might think that you're just flowing the easy way, and you might be flowing like water, but then you might decide that you want to stop and talk to somebody, or you saw something that caught your interest, and so you're going to stop and you're going to come off. But in whole, the crowd, you're still going to know what that flow rate's going to be, even though any one person could make a choice to do something different. And unless they're going to affect everybody, which is pretty unlikely, you can pretty much predict how the group is going to work. And so I see us in this, what often is called in Christian circles, a spiritual topic, being very relevant to modern physics. And to your point that you were talking about in terms of the constants, my favorite, I actually say this in class, it's even in my book, even the textbook, and that's how we form carbon how we form carbon in stars. There's a very, very small resonance, when you take two helium nuclei and you smash them together, they'll stay together for the very smallest fractions of time. So it's really not even a bound state. It's more just a resonance. In other words, they're just like spinning around each other. Does that make sense? But there's
Yes.
a little bit of attraction, and they just kind of do this kind of a thing. But that small amount of slowing them down is enough in the core of a star for every once in a while another helium nuclei to come in and have what's called, for all intents and purposes, a three-body interaction. So that they're all almost coming together at the same time, and boom, you make carbon. And without it, there's no carbon. And guess what happens with no carbon?
No matter.
I think I will say that this may be minor or silly, but the fact that it's 3 when it comes to spiritual things, especially Christianity, sticks out to me.
I've never made that analogy, but I see it now.
And one of the things that you said before is that that the creator can move outside of, he's outside of his creation. He's more than his creation. He can change it at will. And that is the kind of a very scientific look at, I've had conversations about determinism, about predestination and all of this. And people always make this claim that if God knows, then thus he has determined it.
Mm-hmm.
And I find this to not be, for me at least, the most compelling argument, because one, I don't think a lot of people who are thinking this way take into consideration that God is not bound by time and thus can see all it. He can see it all. He's not bound by it. He's outside of it. He sees it all in one glance. So I think that's not super compelling to me. And then on top of that is, if I wanted to make a more philosophical argument, a more an analogy of parenthood, is, I have children, and I have 5 of them, believe it or not, and I know what's going to happen if I put a piece of candy in front of each of those children. And if I tell them, hey, if you sit here and you don't eat this candy, and I'll come back and I'll give you 2 pieces if you don't eat it, I know which ones will eat it immediately, which ones will take some time, and which ones will wait and get that extra candy. And so in my mind, if there is a perfect God who knows me perfectly, regardless of what my free choices are, at the end of the day, his perfect knowledge of me, in addition to him being outside of time, that means he knows what I'm going to do because he knows me personally, in the way that I think, the way that I act, and the way I react. And so, like, I don't see maybe this isn't clear to everyone. I've had this conversation before and people are like, I don't get that. But for me, I just don't buy the deterministic case that because he knows, then thus it is determined. Does that make sense?
That's good.
Sorry, I just real little tangent there. But one of the things that I found interesting on your TikTok recently was someone had asked about your conversion story, and in the comment that you'd shared, the word Ouija was in it.
Yeah.
And I think the word atheist and Ouija was in it, and I was like, well, that's an interesting mixture of things. And then you also talked about baptism in the Holy Spirit, and you talked about the voice of God, and I'm like, I want to hear this story so badly. So if you would be willing to share that, your kind of background in atheism and that change, that shift, I would adore hearing it.
Okay. Yeah. It's time. So I was raised in a secular home, and from a young boy, I wanted to be a scientist when I grew up. And so I adopted what I had understood to be a scientific worldview, which was that of an atheist. And so I considered myself as a person that did not believe that God existed. What you could see and touch and smell and feel, that was it. That was all that existed. There wasn't anything else. And so I got into a crowd of people that were, I don't know, 2nd generation hippie children or something like that. And some of them were practicing witchcraft. And as an atheist, to me, that was Hollywood, right? It was entertainment. It was nothing more than, the Hocus Pocus movie or whatever, but just Hollywood. And so I started participating, and it was entertaining, right? If you're an atheist and you're practicing and you're watching, witches do their stuff, it's like, okay, whatever, And the Ouija boards, those actually caught me interest because I could interact with those. And the tarot cards, they get boring pretty fast. But the Ouija boards,
unless the tarot cards are making you money off of children in parks.
sure.
Hey, just personally call me out, okay?
Sorry,
I
go
paid
ahead.
my rent one summer reading tarot cards in Piedmont Park, which is, not the most ethical way to pay your rent, but hey.
So,
Sorry,
go ahead.
please go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, that's what it was. That's what it was. And my experience with it was that it would do some very impressive things. It would like if somebody came in and they weren't a believer, it would start to say things about them that, as far as we could tell, nobody touching the board should have known, and it would completely shock the person that heard it, because they would say, "There's no way either of you could have known those things." And it would do things about yourself as well, telling you things, and they were very impressive, right? Like I said, it had a very intrinsic entertainment value when you really got into it. So I started to study it, and I found that in the Middle Ages, the witches of the Middle Ages, they didn't have like these little letters. They would make a planchette which had two little sliders and a pencil, and it would just spell out words. It would be like automatic writing, and so I actually had made those, and it worked just fine. Well, I was convinced that what it was just my subconscious making a move. I just didn't know that my hands were moving it, right? It was just your subconscious. And that's why it could do impressive things, because the subconscious was impressive, right? It could tell you these things that nobody could figure out because your subconscious somehow figured it out and you didn't realize that you'd figured it out, right? Or whatever. And so I started to get bored with it because I started to realize that it had a pattern that to me was rather pernicious. And so it became kind of boring, because it was rather insidious in some of the things it would say. It's like, I don't think I like that. I don't want to be like that. That's not me. And so I was saying, I think I'm done with this. This is a joke. You're not real. You say you're this spirit, this powerful being. You're not, right? You're my subconscious. That's it. And it said, well, I can prove it. I'm like, please. I would love that. Please prove it. My subconscious, I would love to see what my subconscious can do to prove this. Please. And I said, well, what would you like me to do? And I said, turn the lights on and off. And I said, okay. I'm like, they didn't go on and off, right? I'm like, well, are you going to do it? They said, yeah, I will. I can do whatever you want me to do. I'll do all kinds of things. I said, right there. Turn the lights on and off. And it started interacting with me like this about the things that it could do and all these different kinds of things that it could impress me with. And I was just getting tired of it, right? I was like, yeah, this is exactly what my subconscious would do, because it can't do that, right? And then they started going on and off. And I just panicked, right? I stood up. I was about right before I screamed, they came on and they stayed on. And I was alone in my friend's room, and the light switch was right behind me. So there was nobody there. And I ran out of the room, and I ran up to my friend. I said, Johnny, the lights in your room are going on and off and on and off. And he said, calm down, Rob. They're fluorescent lights. They flicker. I said, no, they're going on and off and on and off. And he's like, dude, chill. They're just lights, right? And so it did some other things as well. But that was the one that was the real trigger for me, right? That when that had happened. And so as a result, I continued to try to rationalize and to try to interact for some period of time. I wanted to, for a minute I said, well, there must have been a mouse in the wall, scratching itself right up against the wire. Right then, it just happened to be timed right or something like that. Right. I was trying to rationalize these things. And there were a number of other things that were not quite as scary as that occurred. And it took about 6 months to a year afterwards where I was able to articulate what it was that was bugging me about the Ouija board. And what it was that was bugging me is what I realized is that it had this consistent pattern, at least with me, that it would tell you all of these very impressive things, like about people that you don't know, and they would verify it when they would come in, or with somebody you would just meet, or say things about the person across the table that you shouldn't have known. But then it would say these kinds of things until somebody, including yourself, eventually started to believe everything it said. And it's like right when you hit that line, everything after that was the nasty stuff. It was the stuff like, oh, you're a super person. It would feed into your vanity. That's what it was. So it would sound good, but it would just feed into your vanity about how you're better than everybody else, how you're supposed to be some amazing, important person, how you're, whatever it was for you is what it would tell you. And it was like, and that was at the time I couldn't articulate it, but it didn't sit right. And so at that point I came to the conclusion that thing's evil. That's just wrong to do that to people, to tell them things like that. That's going to build them up to see themselves as being better than other people. And so what ended up happening, and this comes into the baptism of the Holy Ghost. I'd never met another Christian at that point. I had not. I was living in Salt Lake City. I knew a number of Mormons, but I never talked to them about it because I had rejected Mormonism at a young age. And so I just sat down and I read the Bible. I had to read it twice. When you're on your own and you're an atheist, you don't get it the first time.
Yeah.
If someone's,
I can relate to that.
If someone's not going to explain it to you, it's like, what in the world did he have to die on the cross? What's that got to do with anything? Why didn't he just, if he's God, just poof, right? What's he got to do on the cross for? That made no sense to me. But after I'd read it the second time, it's like, oh, okay, this is starting to make sense. And I was actually able to understand it to the point where I actually started to teach it to my friends. I was like, yeah, I believe this. And there was this one friend, I was up and I was preaching to him and preaching to other people, wanting to share this new knowledge that I had. That was pretty exciting to me. And he went to bed and I went upstairs and started praying. And I was praying for some period of time. I was saying, Lord, I know you hear me because I pray to the God that knows everything. And that's why I know I'm not praying to this wall. It's you that I'm praying to. And I was praying like that for some period of time until there came a moment where I knew that his ear was right at my mouth. And I said, Lord, with all my mind and soul, I want to do your absolute will to the best of my ability. And I meant it. And then the Spirit of truth was right in front of me. And it came inside of me and it filled me. And he spoke to me audibly. And he said, Rob, if any man will, with all his mind and soul, want to do the absolute will of the Lord to the best of his ability, then he's doing it. I just went, whoa. I remember looking at my hand and the Spirit was even in my pinky. I was like, I just got filled with this Spirit completely. And so I knew that it was the Spirit of truth. I didn't know what the Spirit of truth was, but I knew when it was in front of me that that's what it was. It's like a good analogy would be like in a dream, you just know something's true. Like you see something and it came from somewhere. You don't have any history, but you just know because it's your dream. That's what it was. It was that same kind of knowing that when that Spirit was in front of me, I just knew that it was the Spirit of truth. I didn't hear anything. It was just like, that's the Spirit of truth. And then it came inside me and it filled me. And then I just opened up the Bible. It was like to John 14 through 16. I realized I just got baptized in the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
And then a couple other times he spoke to me as well, trying to straighten me out of some silliness that I got myself into. But that's how I got baptized in the Holy Ghost. So I'm in it for life. I'm there for the long haul.
Awesome.
Well, and it was fascinating for me to hear you say that you heard his voice audibly.
Yeah.
Because I haven't personally in the way of actual auditory, but the way I describe it is I have heard God speak to me. I call it the inaudible but what's the word I use? I don't know why I'm flipping it. The inaudible but unmistakable voice of God. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you a for instance. When I met my wife, she was not really in the Christian way. Mm-hmm. So she was into things like tarot cards and stuff like that. And me being a good Christian boy from essentially birth, I
love the way you say that. A good Christian boy.
Yeah,
go ahead.
From birth. I mean, don't let the armful of tattoos confuse you. I have been a Christian since I have a degree in biblical studies. Like this has been my entire life. This is what I care about the most, what I'm most passionate about. But when I met my wife, she was not really on that same path as me, and it freaked me out. We went on one date, and I was like, God, I really like this girl. I feel something very special and important about her, but if this stuff is not acceptable to you, we won't go on a second date. We won't continue. And I'm working at the Apple store at this point, and I'm having this stress-filled moment of worry about her, about different things like that. And I suddenly have this peace this overwhelming peace that covers my entire body. Like you said, I saw the Holy Spirit in my pinky. Like my whole body felt it. Sudden peace, and I felt and heard, not audibly, but in my mind, don't worry, I'll take care of her. I've got this.
Cool.
And I said, wow, that's really cool. No one's going to believe me. My mom didn't believe me. My dad didn't believe me. Several people didn't. You know, the verse about don't be unequally yoked came up a lot of times. And so I prayed about this. I made some mistakes in our early relationship. You know, everything wasn't perfect. But we got closer to being married, and we decided to get married on a Thursday on a Sunday morning. So we decided we were going to get married real quick. And so my mom didn't know this. She was at church worried about this heathen that I was dating. And she's praying.
Sometimes we date heathens.
She's praying, and she doesn't know that we're going to get married on Thursday. That's something that's being decided as she's in church. And so we move along with our day. She feels like she gets a word from the Lord, and she talks to the youth pastor and tells him about it. And she doesn't think this means much of anything in that moment. She's invited to the wedding a couple of hours or the next day. She gets to the wedding. We're getting married. And she's freaking out still because I'm marrying a heathen, right? Which you're not a heathen, honey.
Between being invited to the wedding and being at the wedding is a matter of hours. I think I'd be freaking out too.
Yeah, a matter of days, but yeah.
Matter of days.
So we get to the wedding, and we did it at the courthouse, and it happens, and then she shows me her phone, and she was like, I was really worried about this, but you know, God gave me a word, and I texted the youth pastor to tell him what was going on. And I read these texts, and they say, Jeff texted my mom and said, what was it that God told you on Sunday? And it was, don't worry, I'll take care of him. I've got this. Confirmation. This is the same thing told to a different person, same vernacular. Amazing, right? And we get married. We have a very rough couple of months. Like it got to the point we had a miscarriage. We had some really sad things happen. And it was looking like it was going to end just as quickly as it began. And I had been at my parents' house crying, drinking rum when I shouldn't have drank that much rum. No one should have drank as much rum as I did at that point in my life. I just really liked rum. So I was praying about it, and then I hadn't gone to church on a Sunday morning in weeks. I was just depressed. I hadn't done anything. I get to church. I think it was a Sunday in January, and I'm praying. A lady walks up to me that I've known for my whole life. We were never close. She hasn't talked to my mom about things that are going on. I'm on the front row, and it's like praise and worship, but I'm not. I'm sitting and I'm praying. And she sits down next to me. She puts her hand on my back, and she says, Cam, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but God told me to tell you, don't worry. He's going to take care of her. He's got this. And I was like, what? And I'm like, this is bizarre. This is the third time. This is like the most confirmation anyone would ever need. It's like 3 witnesses. You know what I mean?
Like your fleece.
Right. And so I go to bed that night, and I'm like, God, if you're going to do something, do something. My wife texts me the next morning, and she asks me, do you believe that God still talks to people in dreams? I said, yeah, I do. I do believe that. And she goes, well, last night I had a dream that I was in this all white room, and I just heard a voice that said, give him another chance. And that was all that I dreamed. And she said, I think we need to fix what's broken, and I think we need to move back in together, and we need to fix this, move on. And I was like, oh, wow, I've never told this story to my audience. So you're getting this is a first. So we get back together. We move into an apartment together. We struggle. We've always had some financial struggles. It's just the way of life for us. But 8 years and 5 children later, God is using us. God is challenging me daily. He is using this show in ways that I didn't expect. We've had a couple people say, hey, I would like to know more about Jesus because of the conversations you've had. This show was about politics at first. It was about politics. And I said as many dirty words as could be said. But it just goes to show, you don't have to believe me that this happened. I know that you guys do. But the audience, you don't have to believe me that this happened. But you cannot strip that away from me. You cannot strip that experience away from me. You cannot strip away what I call, like I said earlier, the inaudible but unmistakable voice of God. So I agree with you, Robert.
I've been thinking about miracles a lot lately, especially in terms of like our understanding of the natural universe, because miracles are something that a lot of people who are atheistic point at and say, well, this isn't a possibility. How can 5 loaves of bread become 5,000 loaves of bread? How can a virgin give birth? How can a man be raised from the dead? And there's this assumption that goes along with miracles that says there's a regularity to nature based on our experience of nature. And therefore, these things are outside of our experience and therefore impossible. But our understanding is so limited, and it doesn't account for things like quantum mechanics. Like my experience does not account for the things I am told about quantum mechanics. And I do think that God works in these margins that we don't, conceptualize necessarily, but aren't supernatural. They're every bit as natural as anything else. It's just that we don't have a way of perceiving them. And that's fine. I mean, like my brain is made out of flesh and blood. Like how much of the universe can I really perceive with a brain that's made out of flesh and blood,
Yeah. Well, I've been reading Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright lately.
I thought that C.S. Lewis has a similarly titled book. I thought that was
his is Surprised by Joy.
Surprised by Joy.
But this is Surprised by Hope, and he's been talking about the resurrection and about how the Pharisees believed in the general resurrection of people at the end, and the Sadducees didn't, and that there was no other resurrection in the pagan world outside of Judaism at that point. And he's talking about all these different aspects of that. Mm-hmm. And as I'm reading this, and I'm reading about how the Pharisees had an issue with the idea that a single person in the middle of history would be resurrected before everyone else was unthinkable to them. Mm-hmm. And he's talking about science and history. And I was struck with this thought last night as I was reading it, which was that with science and with the way we understand the world, we are bound by history. We are not looking at the future. We aren't looking at the new. And so when it comes to miracles, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, when it comes to all of these things, we are functioning out of an outdated understanding in a world built by a God who, like Robert said, can change anything at his whim. And I just wanted to mention that. I find that fascinating. I don't know if that resonates with anyone else,
Robert,
but I find it fascinating.
I do want to, and I already think I know the answer to the question, but I do want to ask you, do you ever, because you do work in scientific fields, have moments where you say, okay, I have to think of this as a scientist, and other moments where you say, okay, I can think of this as a Christian? Do you ever have this separation of the two, or do they ride in tandem with you?
I think in Christianity, they're mated quite well.
Okay.
For me, I think you could see this quite easily as well. For me, Jesus said in the book of John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. To me, Jesus is truth, right? When
Yes.
Pontius Pilate looked at him in the face and says, "What is truth?" He didn't realize that truth was staring him in the face. He
Yes.
couldn't see it if it was right in his face. And as a Christian, to me, truth is objective.
Mhm.
And by that statement, that means that it doesn't matter what I say, doesn't matter if I exist. Truth is still going to be the truth. Doesn't matter what my perspective is, or your perspective, or anybody's perspective, or whether anybody exists. The truth transcends everything. Doesn't matter if the universe exists. Doesn't matter if the universe did or didn't ever exist. The truth would still be there. It has no beginning. It has no end. And it would be the only thing that would exist outside of this universe in an absolute way. And so in a literal sense, truth is God. And so truth is the maker of reality as we know it. And so if I'm going to study reality, I think I'm going to be in a I'm going to have a big problem as a scientist if I divorce myself from truth.
Mm-hmm.
And if I think that my truth is the only truth that matters, then I'm going to be missing a lot of truth as a scientist.
Mm.
That's one of those sayings that I've said a number of times, because people like to bring they seem to think that truth coming from a source that they don't approve of stops being truth, that it's poisoned by the person that it comes from. And so one of the sayings that I use a fair amount is, all truth is God's truth, regardless of where truth comes from. Like you said, I remember when I read that verse with new eyes the first time. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. Like, he is the truth. He is the word. He is the perfect image of our perfect God. And creation screams of his presence, his goodness, and his creativity, and his math skills, even though I'll never understand them. But
if I take this cup and take a drink of it, my brain, through the neural network, the machine learning, it has equivalently just solved a second order partial differential equation with boundary conditions. If I'm going to program a robot to do that, that's what that robot has to do. And you do it with ease, right? And that's not speaking about simple algebra, the kinds of things with rate, right? Being able to speed up and slow down and make it something and grab something and figure out where to stop. That's what I'm talking about. That's this calculus and statistics that transcends everything as far as we know it. And you are masterfully built to be able to do that with ease in that brain of yours.
Yeah, we're beautifully and wonderfully made.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis had said about if everything in the universe was an accident, and just accidents compounding on top of each other to create the human being, it's as though you spilled a glass of milk on a table and it produced a perfect map of London. Like, the idea that that could happen is pretty far-fetched. I mean, sure, probabilistically, there is a instance where that could happen, I suppose, but it's not likely. So I always kind of liked that notion of spilling the milk and a perfect map of London appearing. Like, yeah, probably not.
Well, and that's what's so interesting to me is when it comes to robotics and science, is that especially robotics, is they're attempting to recreate the human in some sense, and it's hard, and they find out how extremely difficult it is. I was reading something a couple months ago about how they can crack some movement, they can crack some logic, like, maths and things like that, because you can program that in. But one of the biggest obstacles in robotics is trying to make it so that a computer can see and perceive, because they can't crack it, because the idea of the mind is beyond these limited motherboards, these little creations.
Do you mean like see dynamically? Because like I know that like they have machines that scan like barcodes and things of that nature, like optically, like
right,
or even like surgery robots that can pick up certain materials that it recognizes on a platform. And
right, but it's the ability to see and deduce, I believe. So it's like, if you look at something you don't have to have all of the knowledge of what that is to start making assumptions and figuring out what it is. Whereas
Right, I got you.
with a robot, with an AI at this point, at this juncture, in order to do it, you have to explicitly program these things in. For instance, on TikTok the other day, I saw a guy who's trying to do an AI that recognizes this very thing. And so one of the people said, okay, so scratch your beard in front of your camera and see what the AI picks up. And so that he goes, okay, I don't know why I would do that. And so he turns and he says, okay, so what is this? And he goes and he does this to his beard, and the computer goes, choking. Choking. And so he's like, okay, so there is no, like, if you look at that and you don't know, like, you know that I have a beard because you can see the beard and you know what the beard is by the fact that you can look at my head and you know what hair is. Like, there are all of these associations that are made, and you know that what I'm doing. And so he had to explicitly tell his AI that he had an itchy beard. And that's what it returned with after he explicitly programmed it. So there are absolute limitations. So they can see, but the concept of the mind is so far away, and truly seeing as we understand it has not been broken as of this point.
That's
I would
interesting.
actually disagree.
What was that?
I would actually disagree with that.
Okay.
The machine learning, neural nets, artificial intelligence, I'm pretty confident that we do understand how the brain works, and it's through categories. The way that we interpret visual information, it's the same thing that the automatic cars do, is by categorizing everything and saying, if you see a box, and there are different categories of boxes. If you see the outline of a face, there are different categories of faces. If you see the outline of a street, there are different categories. And by having categories and subcategories, you can parse the information and process it in such a way as you can figure out what categories you're in. Now, it takes an enormous amount of training data. You have to be able to train it on a large database, and that database is going to drive things like the choking, right? If you don't have, if it's never seen somebody scratching your beard, you're not going to know how to interpret that. And that's the way that a baby would interface with the world around it, using machine learning to categorize everything. And once all these categories are very well defined, then we can do really accurate interpretations of the data of new data that's fed. And that's how machine learning works, is by mimicking these neural networks. The way that a neuron has lots of connections with other neurons. That's what we're doing mathematically, with multiple layers of nodes that are connecting multiple nodes. And then the way that they all connect from a given test item, after you run it through this neural net, that gives you a little bit of information. But if you tell it what this is, and you tell it what enough of these pieces of information that you're getting, then you can really build up an AI that can do extremely well predictive behaviors. And that comes from recognizing that the way that the brain is working is what we can simulate in a computer. Now, they are extremely limited because garbage in, garbage out. But the power that we've seen is tremendous in terms of being able to, just the fact that we can do automatic driving is a really good example of being able to interpret what you can see on the road and be able to figure out, should I slow up, slow down, speed up, turn left, turn right, or whatever the case might be, based on interpreting that incident data. Now, being able to have one that can do everything that the brain can do, that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But in terms of how the brain thinks logically, the science says that's why we call it artificial intelligence, neural networks. This machine learning is exactly that. It's our best understanding of how the brain works in terms of the logical processes. Being able to do the same level of computation, yeah, we're way off from that. But being able to simulate the same processes is why we have such power with machine learning.
Well, I will say I did read this months ago, so they may have broken through some of the pieces between that. But I do find it just fascinating that no matter what, there's an uphill battle to try to recreate humanity and to recreate most anything. And like, I just don't want them to make fake meat. I'm not interested in that. That's one thing I'm not interested in. Like, let's just not do that.
Or the robot dogs, because like we had a whole book about these robot dogs. We know where this leads, and I just don't like the direction that Boston Dynamics is taking with this. It's like, I read Fahrenheit 451. This is not cool, guys. Like,
But the military has them, right?
right. They're not going to use them for anything good. Like,
Yeah,
I don't like
Terminator.
anything. I have this rule about pets that I won't have a pet that could kick my ass. So these robot dogs, like, they show people trying to like kick them over, and they're like really specially designed not to be able to be kicked over. So not that I'm like kicking dogs or anything. I'm just saying.
I haven't read Dune, and I haven't watched all the way through yet, but I have looked into some things, and I do just basic thing. I do find it very interesting that there was a robot uprising thousands of years ago in the Dune world, and part of the reason humans developed the way they did is because they outlawed all thinking machines. So that's fascinating to me. It's an interesting layer of science fiction.
Yeah.
So, Robert, thank you so much for coming onto our show. I have enjoyed this. I've learned a lot. I've got to talk about the thing I'm most passionate about. It's the perfect episode. One of the things that we do on every episode is most people, I'm sure you've noticed, there's a lot of despair in the world right now. There's a lot of people that are in very dark places. There are a lot of people who have had family members lose businesses, jobs, or other family members. And so there's a lot of darkness and lack of hope for people. And so we're a show of hope. And so one of the things we like to ask our guests when they come on is, and this is kind of putting you on the spot, so I'm sorry, but what is something right now, and it doesn't have to be, it can be personal, it can be global, it can be scientific, whatever floats your boat. What right now gives you the hope and the motivation to continue on and to blaze through into the future?
The new fission battery technology that's coming out. That's kind of scary impressive. There are these micro reactors that you would be able to put in a transportainer that would give you, say, on the order of, say, 10 megawatt output for a decade. And it looks like the military is going to fund them because they want to, if they could, then they don't need oil anymore, right? They could electrify their fleet. And if they electrified their fleet, their supply chain would go away. All they need is just water and food, right? They don't need, and because that's where most of the casualties and damage was in the Middle East, was the supply chain, getting all that oil and gasoline up there to operate everything. But if they had these fission batteries, you put it in a bunker, this thing's powering batteries. You just come back and swap out batteries, and you've got power ad infinitum with these fission batteries. And the reason why that's exciting is because the military has made it clear that if they're going to be successful in the future, Congress is going to need to fund it. And so guess what? The national laboratories are putting forth an effort to develop these. And once the military has them, it's not long until we will. And once these fission batteries are out, we don't need gas stations all across the interstate. We don't need, because that's a very concentrated form of energy that you can just go up and get this huge concentration of energy and keep going all the way across the country. If we were going to have electric vehicles to do that, we're going to need new grid infrastructure to supply a lot of electricity to make these batteries. But if we have these little portable fission batteries, you can have electricity anywhere, anytime. And especially up north, Alaska would be desperate for them because you can make these modular, you can scale them up, and they are what appears to be the fastest route to completely electrifying the transportation sector. The only thing that's left that wouldn't be done necessarily would be jet fuel. Because once you've got the transportation sector, all of the cars off of gasoline, now all you need is oil for a lubricant and making plastics, right? And we could supply all of that just locally. We don't need to go globally if that's all that we're using our oil for. It's just for making products, right? It just goes to almost a standstill. And then that stuff just goes into manufacturing instead of burning it for transportation and heat. And so that looks like is going to be the breaking point where we're going to maybe be able to make a vast transition to electrifying the transportation sector. And if that occurs, I would assume that it's going to be not difficult to electrify the power sector as well. So that electrify, take us off of fossil fuels. So we're not burning fossil fuels for heat. Again, those fossil fuels go for manufacturing, for making consumer products. And so I think that's a big hope for nuclear science and technology to be able to make that transition. But it does require we do a lot of research. The national labs are doing that now.
On just a personal note, I want to say that you've actually dispelled and disabused me of a lot of my own personal fears toward just this entire topic, especially the idea of radiation. It's something that I did have a pervasive fear about. And you've alleviated me quite a bit of that. And so on a personal note, thank you for doing that. I really appreciated you giving us your time today for that.
My pleasure. I'm here to serve.
Thank you. You've done well. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you
Right.
for not only, giving us knowledge about nuclear, but also going into your personal life and going into your Christianity, your religion, all of that. That's wonderful. A lot of people say that you shouldn't talk politics or religion, and I want to talk religion way more than a lot of people are comfortable with. So I appreciate you. If people want to, what I'll do is I will tell people where to find you. And I'll take you off during the boring stuff when we talk. If you want to hang out and talk to us some more, feel free to do so. If not, don't. But if you want to find Dr. Hayes, he has a TikTok, which all you have to do is type in nuclear science lover and you're going to find him. Very simple, very good branding. Could it be more clear? I also have in the notes his profile from North Carolina State University, where it has all the different things that he's writing and he's working on. So if you want to see his technical work, that's where to go. It's down in the description. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience or point them to before you go?
Please remember, Jesus loves you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we will see you in a minute. And with that, dear audience, now it's time for the boring stuff. Actually, I think it's exciting, but So let's talk about what's coming up soon. So this next month is surprisingly filled with doctors. We started with Dr. Hayes. We're going to talk to Dr. Rebecca Simon next week, who is a pirate historian. I've never heard of that. Really wanted to talk to someone who is a historian of pirates. She has a PhD in it. And then our good friend Kate Sherrill from Burials and Beyond is coming back, and she's going to talk about Gothic literature and the Gothic spiritualism that went on during that time. Then after that, probably, all of our episodes are pretty cool. But I have never talked to someone who's been bitten by a shark, and I've wanted to my whole life. And so at the end of this month, we're talking to Shannon Ainsley, who is a surfer who was attacked by 2 great white sharks at the same time, and then was later, from what I understand, hunted by orca in some way. And so now he just surfs in the Arctic. It's fascinating. Can't wait to talk to him about that. And then we get into the Christmas stuff, dude. First episode of December, we're having Brad Jerzak on. And we're going to talk about Mary. We're going to talk about the Incarnation. And we're going to talk about how Christianity, despite what everyone's told you, is a women's rights movement. It was good for women before anyone else. So it might be controversial, but we're going to have
been
fun.
Trying to do this episode since we've started. Guys, I'm so excited about this.
So beyond that, we are currently in our first week of the John Bible study. We're walking through John 21 days, and we're meeting every week to talk about the previous 7 chapters. Our first Zoom meeting is tomorrow night. So if you want to join us, it's not too late. 7 chapters isn't too much. You could do that in one sitting, and you can join us tomorrow night. Just tweet at me, message me, and I will give you the Discord info and throw you into the Twitter group chat if that's what you prefer. So join us on that. Beyond that, again, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Ryan. Get some coffee, rymcoffee.com, promo code the Mad Ones. Get some beef jerky, righteousfelon.com, promo code Mad Ones. We're on, if you're listening to us, watch us on youtube.com/themadones. We're also on Rockfin. We're on Odyssey. You can find us by typing our name. Easy enough. Buy a shirt. I think they're pretty good. Buy a shirt. If you don't want a shirt, in the next couple of days, I will be, I'm still working out some details, but I will be posting a link for coffee mugs. I believe that I have 3 different versions right now. Or 6 different versions, 2 different designs. Keep an eye out for that. Beyond that, find me on Twitter at Cam Harless, Jessica at Soup Canarchist. And if you want to listen, wearethemadones.com store. I said buy a shirt and I didn't tell you where. wearethemadones.com/store. And so that's it. Got anything for them?
No,
No.
just my usual.
Okay. So as always, you have the chance to be a light in the world. So go light it up.